When America rolled its tanks into Vietnam, they were stepping into a battlefield completely unlike the one those machines were designed for. The enemy had almost no armor, no vast open plains, and no tank duels like the ones fought in Europe during World War II. But near the war's final chapters, that would change in a way no one expected. An all-out tank charge that came out of nowhere. And waiting for it were American tanks. But not with American crews behind the controls. We'll come back to that soon. First, let's set the stage. By 1965, US leaders were convinced that the only way to stop communism in Vietnam was to commit ground troops. The first wave landed at Da Nang, 3,500 Marines, and alongside them 2 full platoons of tanks. But the war they were preparing for was not the war they were about to fight. The American military was still thinking in Cold War terms. For decades, their training had revolved around one scenario: halting Soviet armored divisions across the wide open fields of Europe. In those war games, T-54s came thundering across the horizon, and US armor would meet them head-on. Every weapon, every tactic was designed for that kind of battle. Vietnam wasn't that battlefield. Instead of sweeping terrain, there were endless jungles, rice paddies, swamps, and roads so narrow a tank could barely squeeze through. Instead of massive tank columns, they faced an enemy who hid in the shadows, avoided direct clashes, and fought on their own terms. Still, commanders clung to the idea that overwhelming firepower would eventually force the enemy into a decisive engagement. So, tanks rolled forward. The backbone of America's armored force was the M48 Patton, the most advanced tank the US had at the time, armed with a 90mm gun, protected by more than 100mm of frontal armor. It was built to destroy enemy armor in traditional head-to-head clashes. The problem? In Vietnam, there were no tank battles waiting for them. Supporting the Pattons were a range of other armored vehicles. The M113 armored personnel carrier ferried troops into battle while offering light fire support. Some Pattons were converted into Zippos, replacing their cannons with flamethrowers. Then there was the odd-looking M50 Ontos, a small vehicle bristling with 6 recoilless rifles, and finally the M551 Sheridan, a lightweight tank that could be dropped from the sky and carried an enormous 152mm gun. The North Vietnamese did field armor eventually, aging Soviet T-34s and Chinese Type 59s, but in the early years they were rarely seen. Interestingly, the Australians brought their own Centurion tanks into the fight. Though they had fewer of them, they were deployed with greater caution and precision. And in many battles, those Australian crews would prove far more effective than anyone anticipated. At first, US tanks were used mainly to secure bases and guard supply lines. But that would change with Operation Starlight. Americans. Intelligence warned of a major Viet Cong offensive. Instead of waiting to be attacked, the plan was to strike first, smash their defenses, and cripple their ability to fight. Tanks rolled out to secure vital convoys, carrying desperately needed supplies. But in doing so, American commanders made one critical mistake. The armored column pushed forward without infantry support. Rolling down narrow jungle roads, blind to the tree lines above and unprotected on the flanks, they were marching straight into disaster. It came suddenly. The lead tank took a direct hit from an RPG just before reaching open ground, where it might have fought back effectively. Disabled and burning, it blocked the road behind it, trapping the rest of the column inside the dense jungle. That's when the real ambush began. Viet Cong fighters poured fire from every direction, swarming the stalled convoy in brutal, close-range combat. Communication collapsed, chaos took over, and the column began to unravel. One tank at the rear managed to reverse out and race for help, while another, the only one still operational, kept firing relentlessly, holding the line and preventing total annihilation. Only when the Viet Cong expected reinforcements to arrive did they melt back into the jungle, leaving the battered survivors to be rescued the next day. On paper, Operation Starlight was marked as a success. But for America's first real tank engagement in Vietnam, the cost was staggering. Nearly a quarter of the crews were dead or wounded. And this was only the beginning. In the years that followed, US forces surged, and hundreds of tanks poured into Vietnam. Yet it was already clear this was the wrong battlefield for armor. Commanders still clung to the belief that one day the enemy would finally stand and fight conventionally, and when that happened, American firepower would crush them. That showdown would come eventually, but not in the way anyone imagined. For now, the jungle dictated the rules of war. The terrain stripped tanks of every advantage they were supposed to have. Confined to narrow roads and trails, they became predictable targets for mines, ambushes, and RPGs. The Viet Cong perfected a tactic called hugging the belt, closing in so tightly on US troops that tanks couldn't use their long-range firepower. The mighty 90mm gun of the M48 Patton was useless against enemies hiding just a few yards away, its barrel unable to depress low enough to hit them. Tank crews had to improvise. Gunners rode exposed on the turret, wielding shotguns or grenade launchers, while commanders sometimes fired the main gun themselves. Specialized beehive rounds, thousands of tiny steel darts packed into a shell, became the weapon of choice for clearing enemy fighters at point-blank range. Crews even joked about scratching each other's backs, firing beehives at tanks swarmed with enemies to clear them off, an act that unbelievably did happen in multiple battles. But the war wasn't fought only in the jungle. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, American armor was thrown into brutal urban combat. Cities like Hue became death traps for tank crews. RPG fire rained down from rooftops, alleys, and shattered windows, striking from every blind spot. Visibility was almost non-existent inside the tanks, and to make matters worse, commanders ordered crews to restrict their fire to avoid damaging historic buildings. Worried about how it might look to the public back home, tankers sometimes had to request permission before firing, even with an RPG aimed directly at them. Calling their situation frustrating would barely scratch the surface. Yet soon, American tanks would finally meet the kind of battle they had been built for, though in a way no one had ever imagined. The North Vietnamese army had possessed tanks since the late 1950s, but they rarely committed them to combat. That changed in 1968 when more advanced Soviet-built machines like the T-54 began arriving. By March of 1969, Vietnam witnessed its first true tank-versus-tank clash. At a remote outpost known as Ben Het, 3 American M48 Pattons sat dug in on the high ground. Equipped with infrared night vision, their crews spotted the faint outlines of approaching PT-76 light amphibious tanks. At last, the conditions seemed to favor American armor. Within moments, 2 enemy tanks were destroyed, but not without cost. A lucky enemy round struck an open hatch, killing 2 US crewmen before the remaining North Vietnamese tanks withdrew. It was one of the rare times in Vietnam where American tanks were used exactly as intended. Yet this skirmish was merely a preview. As US forces began drawing down in the early 1970s, the North Vietnamese, backed heavily by the Soviet Union and China, were preparing something far larger. In 1972, they unleashed the Easter Offensive, more than 150 tanks thundering forward alongside 30,000 troops. Suddenly, the same landscape that had once seemed like the worst possible place for tanks erupted into a full-scale conventional assault, more reminiscent of World War II than guerrilla war. South Vietnamese crews, manning the M48s left behind by American forces, dug in on high ground to meet the advancing spearhead. In one dramatic encounter, they managed to destroy 11 T-54s in rapid succession. But the offensive was massive, relentless, and lasted 7 brutal months. And in the end, it was only a matter of time. The final chapter came in 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the defenses and rolled triumphantly into Saigon. So in the end, American tanks had been thrust into a war they were never suited for, and then pulled out just before the fight they were designed to win finally arrived.